In India, the intersection of caste, gender, and social expectations has long created a system of entrenched inequalities, particularly affecting women. Widows, especially those belonging to the lowest rungs of the caste system, have historically been marginalized, subjected to severe stigma, and left to fend for themselves in harsh socioeconomic conditions. These women, often bereft of the support that wealthier or higher caste widows might receive, frequently find themselves forced into prostitution as a desperate means of survival. This video explores the life of widows in India, focusing on the cultural traditions that shape their suffering, the economic hardships they endure, and how these women, often living in brothels, navigate a society that leaves them with few options. The history of sex work in India is a multifaceted narrative that intertwines with social, economic, and cultural dynamics over centuries. Sex work has existed in India since ancient times, with references to courtesans and temple prostitutes found in texts such as the Kama Sutra and various classical Indian literature. In many regions, these women were not only providers of sexual services, but also held significant cultural roles as artists, entertainers, and intellectuals. Courtesans were often well-educated, patronized by the elite, and enjoyed a certain level of social respectability. However, as societal norms evolved, particularly during the colonial period, the perception of sex work shifted dramatically, often stigmatizing those involved. Colonial policies imposed by the British further complicated the landscape of sex work in India. The Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 classified certain communities as criminal, leading to the marginalization and criminalization of sex workers. This period saw a decline in the status of sex workers, who were often viewed through a lens of moral depravity rather than as individuals with agency. The stigmatization continued post-independence, with sex work remaining largely unregulated, and those involved often facing legal repercussions and social ostracism. One of the tragic dimensions of this narrative is the plight of widows, many of whom are forced into sex work due to economic necessity and societal marginalization. The intersection of widowhood and sex work highlights the broader issues of gender inequality and the lack of agency afforded to women in Indian society. Widowhood in India has a long and tragic history. The most notorious and extreme form of widowhood in ancient India was sati, also spelled sati, a practice in which widows were expected or coerced to immolate themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. This practice was believed to be a sacred and selfless act of devotion. The custom was particularly prevalent in certain parts of India, and was believed to purify the widow and ensure her husband's soul reached peace. In some instances, sati was voluntary, while in others, it was coerced. Reports from the British colonial era indicate that many widows faced immense pressure from family members and society to conform to this expectation. The British colonial administration, upon discovering the prevalence of sati, initiated legal reforms in the early 19th century, leading to its eventual prohibition in 1829. However, the legacy of sati lingered long after its official abolition. The oppressive social expectations surrounding widows remained entrenched in Indian society. Even without the extreme measure of sati, widows were often expected to lead lives of austerity, isolation, and religious devotion, marked by strict social codes that severely limited their freedom and opportunities. This set the stage for the centuries-long struggle that widows in India would continue to face. Widowhood, particularly in traditional Indian society, has been seen not as a state of loss but as a punishment. Upon the death of their husbands, women were often subjected to a strict set of rules and rituals that emphasized their status as socially undesirable. In many communities, especially in rural and conservative areas, Widows were expected to adhere to certain codes of conduct that stripped them of their individuality and reduced them to a shadow of their former selves. In Hinduism, a widow's social status was irrevocably altered, with many believed to have been spiritually tainted by the death of their husbands. The death of a husband was seen as the loss of the woman's primary social identity and purpose. Widows were often forced to wear simple, plain clothes, typically white as, a symbol of their mourning and their social exclusion. The emphasis on mourning, coupled with their rejection from the social fabric, left them vulnerable to further isolation. Many widows were forbidden to remarry, even though it was common for widowers to marry again. This double standard reinforced their marginalization and deepened their sense of loss. The absence of a husband in their lives left them with no social or economic support, making them dependent on their families or local communities. If they had no family to rely on, they were often left destitute, without access to resources or employment opportunities. The psychological toll of widowhood was also immense. Widows were often viewed with pity or suspicion, and their social standing was considerably diminished. In some cases, they were even accused of bringing bad luck or misfortune to others. The lack of legal and economic rights compounded their misery, leading to a cycle of poverty and social isolation that was difficult to escape. Despite legal reforms aimed at improving the status of widows, such as the Hindu Widows Remarriage
In India,
Act
the
of
intersection of
1856,
caste, gender,
which allowed
and social
widows to remarry,
expectations has
the
long
stigma associated with widowhood remains deeply entrenched in many parts of Indian society. Modern Indian widows, particularly those in lower socioeconomic classes, continue to face systemic discrimination. The promise of equality for women has not translated into meaningful change for widows. In the 21st century, the marginalization of widows has taken a new, tragic form. Economic hardship is perhaps the most significant challenge that widows face today. The social isolation faced by widows can be profound. In many cases, they are excluded from family gatherings, festivities, and religious ceremonies. This exclusion is not merely a cultural norm. It is often institutionalized within the family structure, where widows are relegated to the margins of social life. Such isolation can lead to severe psychological consequences, including depression, anxiety, and feelings of worthlessness. For poor widows, prostitution has become a grim reality. In some areas, particularly in places like Vrindavan and Mutturatu, cities in Uttar Pradesh that are known for being religious centers, widows, destitute and desperate, are forced into the sex trade. Poverty, coupled with a lack of opportunities, pushes them into situations where they feel there are no other viable means of survival. They often live in subhuman conditions, subjected to exploitation by pimps and customers who view them as nothing more than a commodity. Brothels, especially in major Indian cities and rural areas, have become places where marginalized widows seek survival. In these settings, the women often form a support network, though one built on shared exploitation rather than genuine camaraderie. The brothel owners promise them financial stability, but often keep them trapped in a system of debt and submission, with little opportunity for escape. This creates a vicious cycle of dependence on the brothel, where women are sexually exploited and remain isolated from society. Some widows who find themselves in brothels face physical abuse from their clients, and their mental and emotional well-being deteriorates as they experience continuous dehumanization. Despite the difficult circumstances, some of these women maintain hope that their children will not be forced into the same life. However, because the cycle of poverty and exploitation often stretches across generations, many children born to widows in brothels find themselves trapped in the same harsh conditions. The brothel system in India is a grim reality for many women, but it is not the only fate for widows. Some have found refuge in alternative sources of support, such as NGOs that offer shelter, education, and training programs. However, these resources remain scarce, and many women continue to be left out of the social and economic support structures that could offer them a better life. The living conditions of sex workers are often dire, particularly for those who work in marginalized communities or are subjected to trafficking. Many live in cramped and unsanitary environments, which can exacerbate health issues and contribute to a cycle of poverty and dependency. Access to health care is limited, and sex workers frequently encounter discrimination from medical professionals, discouraging them from seeking necessary care. This lack of support can lead to untreated physical and mental health issues, further compounding their trauma. Many face violence and abuse from clients, law enforcement, and even within their own communities. The fear of arrest, coupled with social stigma, creates an environment of constant anxiety and danger. The intersection of poverty, social marginalization, and violence creates a landscape where the rights and dignity of sex workers are consistently undermined. Continue to face extreme challenges rooted in centuries of historical and cultural oppression. From the days of sati to the contemporary exploitation of widows through prostitution, the social and economic marginalization of widows remains a disturbing reality. While there have been legal reforms and efforts to improve the conditions of widows, much more needs to be done to eliminate the systemic discrimination they face. Only by addressing both the cultural prejudices and the economic challenges can we hope to create a society where widows, regardless of their economic status, can live with dignity, respect, and freedom.